La Liga hates him. The manager who built Europe's most brutal team and made Barcelona CRY. How José Bordalás turned Getafe into Spain's most feared underdogs will shock you. Stick around. The final 60 seconds reveal why Pep Guardiola called his tactics not football. You won't believe how he humiliated elite clubs. José Bordalás, born in Alicante and forged in the unforgiving trenches of Spanish lower league football, has become the embodiment of philosophy that wages war on beauty, strangling aesthetics in favor of brutal pragmatism. His teams are not admired, they're endured. His presence on the touchline is not welcomed. It is dreaded. Yet no matter how loud the jeers or how widespread the scorn, his teams continue to rise from mediocrity and challenge giants with nothing but grit, defiance, and a playbook soaked in controlled chaos. José Bordalás has never asked for approval. He was never the darling of a footballing academy, never handed the keys to a super club drenched in riches. He came up in the dark, in places where dreams go to suffocate, managing in the wilderness of Segunda B and Segunda División, before clawing his way into La Liga. By the time he arrived at Getafe CF, known colloquially as the forgotten child of Madrid, he had already built a reputation as a disruptor, a manager with no patience for the flowing poetry of tiki-taka or the carefully orchestrated press of modern football. He didn't care about ball retention, didn't worship at the altar of Pep Guardiola or Marcelo Bielsa. He had a religion of his own: deny, destroy, disrupt. Getafe under José Bordalás did not just play football, they weaponized it. The ball was an afterthought. Possession was something to be surrendered willingly, gleefully even, because what mattered was the chaos that followed. His teams had some of the lowest possession stats in all of Europe, the most fouls committed per game, and yet, somehow, they punched far above their weight. In a league dominated by the flair of Real Madrid and the elegance of Barcelona, Bordalás was a villain, unapologetic and unrelenting. The hatred he drew was almost operatic. Managers would shake their heads in exasperation after playing his teams. Commentators didn't analyze his tactics, they condemned them. Players left bruised and bloodied, their rhythm shattered. Their passing triangles dissolved under an avalanche of crunching tackles and strategic time-wasting. And through it all, José Bordalás stood on the touchline like a conductor of disorder, orchestrating a footballing symphony that few wanted to hear, but none could ignore. What made his team so hated was not simply the aggression or the fouls. It was the way they refused to play the game by its modern commandments. Football in this era is obsessed with identity, with philosophy, with patterns of play. Bordalás mocked all of it. He built teams with no interest in structured build-up, with no time for verticality or pressing triggers. Instead, his philosophy was built around one simple idea: make your opponent suffer. And suffer they did. Getafe, under his stewardship, became infamous for their defensive compactness. The 4-4-2 formation was not a relic in Bordalás' hands. It was a guillotine. The midfield pressed like a swarm. The back line held firm like a barricade. And any ball that entered the central corridor was treated like an act of war. There were no gaps, no soft spaces, no moments to breathe. Opposing creative midfielders were suffocated. Strikers were starved of service, and fullbacks found themselves ambushed by a flood of defensive rotations. But there was sophistication buried beneath the savagery. José Bordalás understood the geometry of space better than most of his supposedly more elegant peers. His teams didn't press indiscriminately, they shadow-marked. They cut off lanes rather than lunging for the ball, forcing opponents into traps that looked like freedom but were, in fact, cages. The pressing was reactive, almost surgical. As soon as a pass was made into one of the invited areas, usually out wide, a coordinated swarm would collapse on the receiver, squeezing time and space into nothingness. This tactic was not chaotic. It was clockwork. And yet, the consequences were brutal. Getafe ranked at the top of nearly every defensive statistic that implied violence. Fouls, cards, stoppages, duels. But this was no accident. José Bordalás knew the game did not reward beauty. It rewarded control. And every foul was a reset, every delay a disruption. Every yellow card signaled to the opponent that nothing would be easy. When Getafe faced off against Atletico Madrid, a team already known for its steel, they did not shy away. They mirrored their resilience, then outmatched it. Antoine Griezmann found no room between the lines. Joao Felix was swallowed whole. Long balls flew, crosses were repelled, and in the wreckage, Getafe emerged unbroken, often unbowed. The same story repeated against Barcelona, against Sevilla, against Villarreal. Where other teams bowed to pressure, Bordalás Getafe stood their ground and asked the question, "Are you willing to suffer more than we are?" And more often than not, the answer was no. In attack, they were blunt instruments. There was no rhythm, no pattern, just intent. Goal kicks were launch-long. Center backs skipped lines with direct balls to the forwards. The midfield was a battlefield of second balls, not a canvas for passing artistry. The idea was never craft a perfect goal. It was to create chaos and feed off the scraps. At most, 5 players would join an attack, and even that was generous. Wingers were asked to cut inside aggressively, to find pockets in transition. The rest stayed back, ensuring the fortress remained intact. This was not football as the world wanted it. It was football as José Bordalás demanded it, and the results were impossible to argue with. Getafe, with one of the smallest budgets in the league, sat comfortably mid-table and even flirted with European qualification. Against all odds, they made their way to the UEFA Europa League knockout stages. For a club with limited means, this was nothing short of miraculous. But the miracle was not welcomed. It was resented, because in José Bordalás, Spanish football saw a mirror it didn't want to look into. A man who refused to evolve, yet kept winning. A manager who didn't believe in aesthetics, but master efficiency. A tactician who asked not how to dominate the game, but how to survive it better than anyone else. The media didn't know what to do with him. Commentators were flustered. Anti-football became the buzzword. Opposing managers labeled his style dangerous, unattractive, a step backward. Pep Guardiola famously once said, "What Bordalás does is not football." But Bordalás didn't flinch. In fact, he seemed to thrive off the hatred. Every insult was fuel. Every criticism was validation. He didn't come to win awards. He came to win matches. Yet despite his villainous aura, there was something noble about his rebellion. In a world where the rich keep getting richer, where clubs build dynasties with oil money and television deals, José Bordalás represented the last gasp of the underdog. He gave teams without pedigree a weapon. He reminded the elite that nothing was owed. Every game had to be fought for. Every point had to be earned in blood, sweat, and fury. And while his teams may not have lifted silverware, they left scars. You remembered the games. You felt them in your bones. They weren't spectacles. They were trials. Still, his methods came at a cost. Players burned out. Matches were attritional slogs. The fans were divided. Some adored the fight. Others longed for a more palatable style. Eventually, the club hierarchy would lose patience, and he would be let go. But it never took long for another club to call. Because when you need to survive, when you need to fight your way out of relegation or shock a giant, there are few minds more reliable than José Bordalás. He later returned to Getafe, as if destiny demanded an encore. The reunion was not romantic. It was ruthless. The methods hadn't changed. The game around him had evolved further, with data-driven scouts, positional play obsessives, and high-octane presses. But Bordalás remained rooted in his creed. Let them dance. We'll drag them into the mud. And time again, it worked. Even when facing squads dripping with international talent, he found ways to dull their edges, to break their tempo, to frustrate their intentions. Getafe matches under his reign routinely posted the lowest effective playing time in Europe, a stat that drew outrage and disdain. But for Bordalás, that was the point. If you can't win the race, slow it down. Force your opponent into a crawl, then catch them off balance. There were whispers of admiration behind closed doors. Managers who condemned him publicly would later admit their envy. Analysts pored over his defensive patterns, reluctantly acknowledging their complexity. Players who hated playing against him often respected the ruthlessness of his preparation. Because what José Bordalás understands is that football is not just art, it is war. And in war, there are no style points, only survivors. In the history of Spanish football, there have been visionaries and philosophers, Men like Johan Cruyff, who changed the very vocabulary of the game. But José Bordalás stands in deliberate opposition to that legacy, not because he lacks the intelligence or the ideas, but because he chose a different truth, one that said you don't need to be beautiful to be brave, one that said defiance is its own kind of elegance. He is not the most hated manager in La Liga because he lacks substance. He is hated because he exposed how much of football's supposed sophistication can be undone by discipline, will, and unapologetic disruption. He is the antagonist in a play that never asked for one, the thorn in a garden that was meant to bloom uninterrupted. And that is why his story endures. Not in trophies, but in tension. Not in love, but in legend. José Bordalás, the man who dared to desecrate the sacred, and in doing so, carve out a legacy not of beauty, but of unforgettable resistance. Do you think José Bordalás is destroying football or exposing its hypocrisy? Would you rather win ugly or lose beautifully? Is he the last offender of underdog football or the reason the beautiful game is dying? Drop your verdict in the comments. And if you're ready for more stories that challenge the game's sacred myths, subscribe and never miss a war like this again.